Hi, good evening, good afternoon, good morning from wherever you are joining. Welcome once again to the Outreach Collective Legends of Outreach session series 5. I'm so happy today to introduce with you our legend of outreach, Mr. Phil Baty. Phil Baty is an international authority on university performance and strategy with more than 25 years of experience in global higher education, including a decade as the editor of prestigious Times Higher Education World University Rankings and its derivative analysis. Phil is a sort of speaker, commentator, and consultant, and he currently leads government affairs activities at THE, the trusted global data and insight partner for higher education sector. Phil was the creator of the World Academic Summit. He oversaw its expansion into the world's preeminent series of university leadership and policy events. Phil has also been listed as one of the top 15 most influential in education by the Australian newspaper in 2012 and in 2016 book Global University Rankings and Mediatization of Higher Education. He is described as one of the most powerful commentators on the global higher education. So thank you so much, Phil, for being here with us. It's an honor. And as I was sharing with you, TOC is a 4-month old baby. We are still like I joke with the community. We are still like a teenager, growing up very fast and trying to understand where we can create an impact because there's so much to do, and everybody comes in with their own opinions about we should be doing this, we should be doing that. This is where TOC should be creating an impact. But one of the factors or one of the areas that we were pretty clear early on is that we wanted to create a platform to invite global leaders who have been at the forefront of higher education development over the last decade or more than a decade. I mean, you have been in the higher education space for more than 25 years, and you have been working at one of the most sought after keyword in the higher education space in India right now. I mean, for the last decade, I can say, I mean, rankings and rankings. I mean, it's part of our government narrative on setting up globally ranked institution. I mean, the new education policy talks about globally ranked and institution being set up in the country. I mean, there is a lot of policy being built around it. There is a lot of the entire higher education narrative in this country is being built around is rankings and what is it that ranking look for, and depending on those factors we design our universities. So I mean, we'll talk more about rankings, and I'm sure there is a lot of questions that community will have you around rankings. We'll get to that, but before that I'd like to take a moment to invite you to reflect on TOC, your first feedback, and you heard from us, you accepted our invitation. I mean, why did you do that? Yeah. And just first remarks from you on this session that we hope to host with you today.
Sure. Well, look, thank you very much for having me on. It's interesting you talk about TOC being a teenager. Times Higher Education, we were founded in 1971, and we are obviously now over 50 years old, but we consider ourselves to be a 50-year-old startup because we're going through such a period of change and development and growth. So we feel that we're still young as well, even though I myself am hitting 50 years old this year, and the THE newspaper itself is just exceeded 50 years old. Look, my interest in what you're doing actually just stemmed from Raj Kumar. He's a great friend of Times Higher Education. He's a regular fixture at THE's events, and OP Jindal Global University has been a partner on a THE event as well. So he's helped us understand the dynamism and the richness of higher education in India, and particularly, I think, the really thriving private sector, the fact that there's really an injection of innovation and an injection of dynamism through the private sector. So it's really Raj's appearance on one of your meetings and my friendship with him that persuaded me very easily that you must have good credentials if you got Raj's time. So I'm very happy to give you my time as well.
No, thank you so much. I'm doing my PhD under Professor Dr. C. Rajkumar. He is my guide. And both of us are working on higher education, development of philanthropy in India, in the private sector. I mean, like we see in US. So thank you so much. I know Professor Raj is like a rock star. And when he agreed to come as a first guest as the Legend of Outreach on TOC, that was a big validation of our efforts as well. I mean, for both me and Bhakti. And when he said, this is something that I would want to give time to, and we are taking a lot of his time, apart from Legend of Outreach session, he also guides us pretty regularly and tells us, this is the kind of people that you should be inviting. So I'm so happy for you to have taken his name. Amazing. So let us start the conversation. I mean, I'd like to begin uh, with your, I mean, in TOC, these sessions are very personal, kind of personal, because we want to know how you started. I mean, for somebody like me in India who, I mean, for ever since, I don't know how long I have been following your work on LinkedIn and Twitter. I mean, it's like you set the global tone for what is happening in higher education, what kind of conversations we should be having around higher education. I mean, you talk a lot about sustainable development goals, you talk about digital universities. I mean, you have been an integral part of hosting World University Summits and coming up with those ideas. I mean, these are the ideas that coming from you and Global North is what we in Global South also are beginning to take a look at and understanding, okay, as I said in my initial remarks, since we are so new in, setting up of our private university space, because public universities in India don't really used to do much outreach. Now they are changing, but private universities, since they have so much more interest in seeing fast growth and development, and they have those processes in place from the first go, we look up to you. So how did you end up in Times Higher Education? I mean, what's the story there? How did you became the Phil Baty of higher education?
Well, it all started for me actually through university itself. When I was a university student, I had an amazing transformational opportunity to travel. So first of all, actually, I was a first generation student. I understood how privileged I was to be able to go to university. My parents didn't go. So getting to university itself was great. It took me out of a village in the northeast of England, an old coal mining village, took me to London, broadened my horizons, transformed my own opportunities. So I've always been a passionate believer in the transformational power of universities. So that's a really important part. But while I was at university, of course, opportunities opened up very dramatically. I met lots of ambitious, talented people, colleagues. And in my first summer break after the first year of university, I ended up in a charity trip, a university-based charity trip to the Gaza Strip and the occupied territories in the West Bank. So very challenging circumstances, seeing life at an extremely difficult phase, obviously with conflict and huge social problems. But I did some volunteering, some charity work there. But while I was there was a real sense of the importance of telling stories, of communicating what was happening, of talking about the situation on the ground, and obviously this sense of shared humanity. So actually, during that trip, I started to do my first writing, my first journalism, and I wrote journalism within the context of higher education and universities. And then it really rapidly developed that I did more and more student journalism, which obviously, as a student and on a student newspaper, it tends to be about higher education itself. Which led me eventually to my first job as a news reporter on Times Higher Education. So actually, I started my entire career as a journalist. I was a news reporter. I moved up to be chief reporter, news editor, deputy editor. But my passion has always been about providing information, seeking after truth, but particularly within the field of education. And really, from that journalism, I ended up being pulled into this new emerging phenomenon called the World University Rankings. They were founded in 2004. While I was there, I got heavily involved a few years later, developed the methodology, saw them exploding into the global consciousness, informing student decisions, and I've never looked back, really. That completely transformed my own career, moving me in different directions. But then also, I think, transformed Times Higher Education, moving it from a primarily print newspaper in the UK to a global resource for students, for university leaders, for governments, a data-driven resource for the global community. So it's been an incredibly privileged and exciting journey, but I'm delighted to be here today to tell the tale.
Absolutely, and you know, it's so heartening to hear you're spending time in the occupied territories and the impact that it had on you as a first generation learner. I mean, and you talk about how you started your first writings there, and the impact education had. I mean, if you can just briefly talk about, what drove you towards education? Is it that from before starting writing, you were interested in education? I mean, what drove you to education?
I mean, I think I was interested in journalism. I think that the wider role, the importance of spreading information, sharing information, the importance of communicating human to human was always there. I think it was partly a coincidence that my early opportunities to do journalism was in the field of education, and also that
Okay.
you write about what you know. So I found myself in the very early stages writing about higher education, writing about being a student back in London in the 1990s. And because this charitable work in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, because that was a university-based charity, I naturally felt this affinity towards the university system. And I think the key there is that understanding the power of education, right? Understanding its ability to transform individuals' lives, of course, understanding its role in social mobility, understanding its role in democracy to enhance our citizenship and our critical engagement with the world we're in. But also, of course, as I got more and more immersed in education journalism, understanding the power of research to transform lives, the absolutely importance of universities to help us make the world a better place, finding the cure to disease, finding ways of tackling the climate crisis, finding hopefully ways to increase and provide food security to population. So that this profound importance of a higher education institution, I would say, for me, the university is the most important institution in the world in terms of what it does to individuals, for education and skills and the economy, but also what it does for society in terms of being the critic and conscience of society, a place of free and open inquiry, and then, of course, the place where the most groundbreaking discoveries will be made to drive humanity forward and push the boundaries of knowledge. So, once I was in there in the early stage of my career, I couldn't possibly leave a sector that was so important and so dynamic, and partly as well so international, so connected, bringing people together from all cultures and all walks of life. So it's been a lifelong passion for those reasons, I think.
Amazing, amazing to know that. I think you have touched upon a theme that we discuss as PhD students in higher education. Is university a public good or a private good? I mean, this debate, whether the impact that education is having, whether the government should be funding it or not funding it, I think we both know where the direction in which we are headed. But I agree with you that the impact that higher education has on, I mean, especially in our country, which is a developing country where we are seeing the impacts that IITs and Delhi University and public universities have been able to have on generations of our learners and their families is immense. I mean, we talk about the success of all these people. It's been because of the public institutions that the government funded. So, I mean, and let's. I would like to get to your journey with Times. I mean, you started in 1996 with Times Higher Education, and you served as their chief reporter, news editor, deputy editor. I mean, a lot of very important roles with Times Higher Education as in journalism. And then you talk about the 2004, wherein you launched the rankings. I mean, so I am assuming there would be a journey for you at Times Higher Education where you were a reporter and then it was rankings, and it from a paper it became more and more about rankings, and today everybody knows Times Higher Education. Definitely, I mean, a layman on the road will know you for rankings. I mean, in India, every time you come out with rankings reports, I mean, it's in the papers, the Times of India or whichever leading paper, the Times of Higher Education. We have so many institutions in top 200 or 300. So can you talk a bit about what motivated Times to come up with these rankings, and what was the environment, what was the ecosystem that was being created at that point of time?
Yeah, so back in actually 2003, there was a probably not a very well noticed report for the British government, the Treasury, actually, a businessman called Richard Lambert. He was, I think, the former editor of the Financial Times. He was also I think for a period, the Director General of the Confederation of British Industry. A UK government report said that there should be a ranking to support government policy making. So interestingly enough, although the rankings are associated with student choice and they are correctly a wonderful resource for students, the origins of the ranking in my mind were actually around policy making. Lambert said that actually governments cannot judge the return on investment, they cannot judge the success of their research funding policies if they can't understand international competitiveness. You know, the top universities in the world compete for the same academic talent, they're publishing on global issues in global journals, so they should be comparing themselves globally. And the idea at the time is British universities would look at each other, Oxford versus Cambridge, Imperial versus UCL, but they wouldn't look to comparators abroad. How do they compare to Harvard, to Stanford, to Tsinghua, to the IITs, of course, or the IISc? So Lambert recommended this, and THE, not myself actually, I was still just a news reporter at the time working alongside this initiative. THE decided to have this first attempt at a ranking. And interestingly enough, we started off in collaboration with a company I'm sure is familiar in India, QS, Quacquarelli Simmons. We worked together. We worked together for a few years to develop a ranking. They were more interested in the student side. We were more interested in the academic side. And what we found was this ranking just exploded in popularity. I think we'd hit a moment of time where the internationalization of higher education was booming. Student mobility was on the very rapid rise. The idea of research becoming much more of a global phenomenon, collaboration over research being much more open. It all exploded. So they exploded into popularity, became a hugely watched, very influential barometer of the global knowledge economy. And then we saw, of course, students flooding in their many millions to come and look at the data because they want to, you know, be informed about the decisions they're making around study abroad. It's a huge investment. So actually, it wasn't until I think 2008 when I was the deputy editor of the magazine that the editor at the time, Anne Ross, said to me, look, these rankings are really important. They're really big. We were getting more and more critical scrutiny of what the rankings did and the role they played. So she put me in charge of the rankings as deputy editor of the paper. And I was then given the opportunity to really review what they were doing, how they were used, what we could do with them. And yeah, absolutely. At that point, my life did change. Absolutely. I then spent the rest of my life on airplanes, traveling the world, talking about rankings, then developing a new framework. We moved away from QS. I decided to develop something separately from QS, something that I think had a bit more academic rigor, something that we felt would hold up to more academic scrutiny. And we haven't looked back since. The whole business has developed dramatically since that pivotal moment, 2004.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And thank you for sharing this context, because a lot of us and a lot of the people in India have not understood or have not had a chance to understand the evolution of these rankings and how and why they came to be. It's just that, you know, they are there, and these Times and QS and Shanghai, and I mean these are the rankings, but very few understand the history and the reason behind their existence. And you're right. I mean, with what started locally for UK would have exploded in around 2008 and 2009. I mean, those are the time that international education and globalization, I mean, were at their peak. And today, when we see at India, you know, hundred thousands and thousands of students going abroad every year. And even though how much people, I mean, there are naysayers and there are people who love rankings. There are people who don't like rankings, and they're like, there is a big debate around it. But nobody can, as they say, avoid rankings. I mean, it's there, and everybody. And when the government takes notice and talks about it in the new education policy, rankings plays a very important role in university, higher education development, management, administration of our institutions. So thank you for letting me know that. I'd like to move on now to what will be your take. I mean, just a broad overtake on relevance of rankings in the higher education. What do you think is the contribution? We'll come to the critique of rankings, but how do you think rankings help higher education institutions?
Well, look, I think there are many ways that they're helpful, and of course, we published them almost as an experiment in 2004, and they became massive because there was massive demand, right? The sector wanted rankings, and I know people get exercised these days about the pros and cons, which we'll talk about, but fundamentally, you know, they were created to help as a policy tool, a strategic tool to help governments and university leaders understand their relative position, the success or otherwise of their funding policies, their strategies, and they still serve that role. So I think absolutely today, I mean, I work with governments more now. My role is really focused on government work now. So now we, the rankings have enabled us to collect literally millions and millions of data points on thousands of universities worldwide. So we can provide data benchmarking, data dashboards to governments worldwide. We can provide those dashboards and insights to universities so they can benchmark themselves, they can help improve themselves, they can identify partners, they can understand the implications of their strategic decisions. So there's that is a fundamental element. I think it's also really important to note that although, of course, the rankings are still dominated by the global north and the Western world in particular, that they are, I think, becoming a really powerful developmental tool for the global south. I think, you know, I've seen and I've written about this for the World Economic Forum. We're seeing a global leveling up. We're seeing that an emerging global community of scholarship and a connected community of universities emerging. And as they benchmark each other and as they gain visibility in global rankings, they can forge partnerships and alliances, and the visibility has a virtuous element where it helps retain talent, attract partnerships. So we are seeing a wonderful leveling up of the playing field. It's still dominated by the West, but we're seeing change. We're seeing a much more equal or a rebalancing in favor of a more equal situation. That's fundamental. I think also the rankings have become a really powerful tool for collaboration, matchmaking, people understanding each other, the position of each other. We hear lots of stories of universities using rankings to eye each other up and decide whether that's a partnership of choice or to identify potential partners. And then, of course, we can't ignore that they are a massive way of ensuring transparency and democratizing student decision making. You know, students in India who study in the United Kingdom or America, they're making a huge investment, a huge financial investment and a personal commitment. And we need to empower them with information and data that informs their decisions. So I think, you know, Times Higher Education has about 15 million students directly on the website looking at rankings to help make decisions. But of course, the halo around that is into the tens and many hundreds of millions because of the exposure of rankings. And for me, it helps. You know, we don't want word of mouth. We don't want prejudice or history to be the determinant. We want as much independent data as possible to help students make those big choices. The most, you know, I guess it is the most important decision a person can make, who to trust with their degree education, their higher education.
Absolutely fair. And you know, I just want to share this. I mean, the critique of rankings. I mean, when I started my international education career, I went to a couple of conferences in the West. I went to US and I went to Canada, and I was talking to the, you know, generally they are much more advanced in terms of career counseling, and I'll not say they're perfect, but there is at least better awareness about career counseling and how to choose university. Then I was part of a couple of global organizations of career counselors, and we used to present and network and, you know, talk about, you know, how and why should a student choose a university. And one of the things that was told pretty regularly at those conferences, and it still is, my colleagues from school, high school counselors here and independent counselors here will agree to it, is like, and not anybody should look only for the rankings. It should be also about best fit universities. And the best fit term became a very vague term for me also. I mean, like, what do you mean best fit? I mean, we can understand, you know, this is the student's, you know, these are his strengths, these are his weaknesses, but there are still 5 institutions that sound like best fit to him. How do you choose the one that is going to be the best for him? So how does ranking help in best fit, you know, finding best fit universities also? I think that's another area that we can probably talk about briefly, if you can share some thoughts.
Yeah, and I think it's important that, the ranking is a hierarchical list. We need to understand the methodology, because each different methodologies produce different results. Different methodologies are designed to capture different things. And the Times Higher Education World Ranking, we need to acknowledge, is a ranking of research-intensive universities, globally focused universities. It is a ranking of what, would traditionally be called the world-class university, which is, probably a German Humboldtian model, but perfected in a sort of post-World War II era in America, where America flooded its universities with research funding and developed this sort of real synergy between excellent research and excellent teaching happening under the same roof. So we have sort of idealized that model, but the most important thing to say is that there's no single great model. We need to look at the method. So for me, about the rankings, we need to disaggregate. We need to say, look, okay, Harvard might be top 10 in the world, but actually, if you're looking at affordability, that might not be the right one for you. If you're looking at cultural fit, it might be a different country. If you're looking at more specific factors around, graduate outcomes, or you're looking more at the teaching environment and less concerned about research excellence, or you want industry connections. So for me, you need to look at the methodology of rankings, and then rankers should be happy to disaggregate and show you, filter by different scores, filter by different areas of performance. So you can build a personalized list to say, okay, I'm not going to America, I want to be in Europe, I want to study X. So you need the subject rankings. I'm much more concerned about industry links and the teaching environment than I am about whether I'm taught by a Nobel Prize winner or a star professor. Personalization, filtering is vital, and the rankers need to constantly be aware that the overall single list is the starting point, and students need much richer and deeper data to make informed choices.
Absolutely. I think so. Rankings actually help students taking informed choices and actually choosing best fit universities. It's not that either or. I mean, both of them complement each other. I mean, that's one thing that is pretty clear from what you said, and it makes sense also. I mean, because a student or a parent, as you said, India is sending thousands and thousands of students every year to education, which is not cheap. I mean, it's very costly if you look at US and Canada and Australia and all these places. And there is a large investment of time and money and resources that has been done. So rankings definitely, I agree, will help in reaching the correct decision. I quickly want to, before I move into the Q&A session, I know we have people waiting for the Q&A, but I want to talk about a couple of your projects that you are working on, the Global Sustainable Development Congress, and the digital universities. I mean, this is separate from, I mean, this is one part of your portfolio, but if you can talk about what are these projects about and share something with the audience about these two projects that you're doing.
Yeah, so I think what's really important is that we've talked about the World University Rankings they've been around for 20 years now, since 2004. But we do recognize there is an extraordinary rich diversity of excellence in higher education globally. And one of the things we've done, which has been really game-changing and I think revolutionary in some respects, is we created an impact ranking, a very different ranking. And that was a ranking based on universities' contribution to the public good, universities' social impact, their economic impact. And the framework we used there was the Sustainable Development Goals. So actually we have a ranking called the THE Impact Rankings, which assess the university's contributions to each one of the individual SDGs and their overall contribution. And for me, that's wonderful, because what we can see is that it's not always Harvard or MIT or Stanford or Oxford or Cambridge doing well. You can see real diversity. And this is where I think you see the Global South starting to prove excellence. If you haven't got a multi-billion-dollar endowment, and if you don't charge tuition fees of $100,000 a year, and you're not awash with riches that allows you to pay huge salaries and attract the best professors in the world and have the laboratories for Nobel Prizes, if you're doing amazing things in your community, if you're transforming people's lives, if you're providing skilled graduates into the community you're based in, that allows for transformation of the local economy, or that tackles SDGs, whether it's sanitation. I know one of the things, of course, in India, we have Indian universities doing exceptionally well in the SDG rankings because they're doing great projects in their communities, water and sanitation, health and well-being, life on land. So this ranking gives a very different perspective of what good
Very
practice
interesting.
is and excellence. And I think with that, we want to make sure that that data is turned into action as well. So the Congress is effectively a gathering, a world gathering of universities, of governments, of industry, of charities to come together to help tackle the SDGs, to help work out how do we deliver them. But what we hope to do is Times Higher Education provides the data that underpins the networking, the matchmaking, so that university funders, corporate funders can identify this university is great at SDG 3 and this university is great at SDG 7. And we could provide connections and matchmakings to convert that into meaningful action and real life projects that will help make a difference on the ground. So yeah, sorry, that's a long answer, but that's where we're coming at from the
Amazing,
SDG.
amazing. I mean, I'm so happy to hear that. I was reading about this on the web today, but when you spoke about this, and this is much more convincing, and it looks like these are really, really helpful, because one of the critique of rankings was this in the initial years was that community engagement. I mean, the impact the university has on the community, the locality that it is placed in, the country that it is placed in. I mean, the kind of students that they are attracting, the kind of backgrounds that they come from, was not being heard. But now that you are doing this, it's amazing to hear. I mean, I want to quickly also cover, I mean, you talked about US, the Humboldtian model of, the German universities. I mean, a university like in US, which funded universities in a big way, brought in research, teaching in the same roof, under the same roof, and became the model, success model for the world, actually. Now that everybody wants to follow that, especially now for us in Global South, I mean, that's the model that we are looking at. But I mean, I keep on reading, and you're a global commentator on higher education, and you keep coming across these articles which talk about the US education, higher education being in crisis. I mean, especially post-pandemic, I mean, students not going to higher education because it becomes just too costly. There are talk about, student debt going out of hand now in US, and, the government talking about, the current administration talking about the waiving of the debt, and, so those kind of scenario. And here we see a drove load of plane full of Indian students going to US, actually spending millions of dollars. And in some ways, I believe saving the US higher education, because there are so many people going from India in droves. I mean, there is a beeline for visas. But when I look at the other end and I read the commentary from the speakers and the higher education commentators there, it's a little alarming for us in India. And we are actually following in the same path. I mean, this is what we are in a way also trying to do in India, have more and more liberal, research intensive teaching, Humboldtian kind of universities set up by private institutions and, funding them. So what do you think? I mean, where do you see higher education evolving in the West and in the East, actually, because both of them are connected now?
I think there's a sense that the fundamental value of a 3 or 4 year residential immersive degree, I think there's something very, very special about that will always be incredibly important. And actually, a lot of the challenge is, well, if technology is moving so quickly and the economies are changing so quickly and jobs are changing so quickly, we just need lifelong learning. We don't need a deep degree. We need skills refreshers and micro credentials and short courses throughout our lives, because we just need to adapt to change. But I actually still believe that there's a core sense that actually the talents we need for the future, and it's a very uncertain future with AI, with machine learning, the very uncertainty of the future means that the core immersive degree, I think, has great value, and that is in teaching people the art of problem solving, teaching people resilience, teaching people how to fail at tasks and bounce back, teaching people how to synthesize different arguments and different situations and respond to them in a creative, proactive way, creativity itself. So the deep learning of, I guess, more of a traditional liberal arts degree, I think, is still profoundly valuable. Even the humanities and the social sciences will be incredibly important to an AI-driven future. The ethicists, the philosophers will be incredibly important in a world where we even question what being human is as machines become more and more intelligent, and we do move towards extremely sophisticated AI. So I do think that core is there. The traditional degree is not dead. The hyperbole that's over with I think is wrong. But I do think there is a challenge around the cost. There's no question in my mind that the return on investment is a huge issue. And I think, speaking specifically of Indian students, again, the investment they make in the fees and the travel and the living, we need to be very clear that universities are really delivering good outcomes. So I think the role of data is important. I noticed it was the President Obama scorecard in America, I think, was really helpful. I think there was a worry that some schools were too exploitative. They were taking the fees, meeting demand for education, but actually the debt was suboptimal because they weren't getting the jobs and careers and the benefits to have that paid back. So we need to look at cost models. I personally think actually the Indian National Education Policy project is really, really good on a lot of levels. And one of the most important ones is you need to increase capacity. You need more Indian young people educated to high standards to protect and strengthen India's economy and to meet the huge demand of young people for skills and talent and drive India's economy. But you need a variety of more cost-effective ways of getting that. So transnational education maybe that might be provided by a foreign university, an American or a British or a European university or Australian, but provided on the ground in India. So there's a reduction in the cost and investment of the individual. That's really positive. I think the idea of blended degrees where perhaps there's a mix of in India and abroad, a 2+1 type model. I think the idea of using technology to increase access in a more cost-effective way, the idea of, reducing degrees to more bite-sized elements, they're all part of the story. I think we need to just offer the flexibility of delivery, the flexibility of model, and put this choice back in the hands of the consumer, particularly with an idea of expanding access at an affordable way. So I think tech plays a huge role in that, and blended options play a huge role.
Absolutely. I agree with you. Thank you, Phil, for that answer. May I now invite our community members who had sent in their questions beforehand. Let's have a quick Q&A round, and then I'll come back to Phil again. I see Harish and Hardik. Hardik, we can start with you with your question, and then we can move on in that order. Hardik, over to you.
Thanks, Ankur. Thanks. Hey, Phil. Hi. So my question is, can you explain how media businesses are run in higher education? And what are current Times Higher Education current revenue streams and models?
Thanks, Hardik. Good question. I can't speak for all of the models, because I think some are more traditional than others. So, the famous Chronicle of Higher Education in America is primarily, I think, a content business. But of course, with a content business, a newspaper and website, there's advertising, there's, opportunities to obviously with hiring and jobs, etc. But looking at Times Higher Education, it's probably worth saying that we are now quite a remarkably rich platform. So within our portfolio, of course, we have the core content. We have Times Higher Education, news, journalism, information on higher ed, with rankings, of course. Within our portfolio, we have Inside Higher Ed, the US platform. So across both of those platforms, we have about 50 million individual people a year coming to consume our content. So content itself is a revenue stream. People will pay on the Times Higher side, at least, because Inside Higher Ed's free to access, but people will pay to access THE content and insights. Of course, that also means that we've got a wonderful audience for advertisers to reach. So universities wanting to demonstrate their strengths or attract talent will use our advertising services, our branding services. The rankings have allowed us to collect a huge amount of data. So we have data and analytics, benchmarking tools, which are a commercial revenue stream as well. They are democratizing higher ed in the sense that people can, really understand performance across the world, choose peers. And I think that it's really important to say data is at the absolute core of everything we do. It's really fundamental to who we are now. It's the insights provided by the data and the insights our experts can take. But we also do events. One of the things that emerged from rankings is that people want to talk about, well, what does it mean for strategy? How do university leaders get together and respond to rankings? It's making their global community smaller and more connected. So we do leadership events, which are revenue drivers as well, delegate tickets, sponsorship revenues, etc. We also do hiring. One of the very early bits of the business was job advertising at the back of a newspaper, vacancies. That's now, of course, global and digital across THE and inside higher ed. So we have multiple streams and multiple ways of connecting. We have membership systems as well. So I think we're unusual in the sense that we're a media organization at the start, but actually we've evolved really to be much more about data, information, connectivity, beyond just media. But media content gives us our honesty, gives us our trust, and is the sort of the glue that holds a lot of this together.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Hardik, for this question. Over to Harish. Harish, if you can ask your question.
Thanks, Ankur. Thank you, Phil, for your time today. It's a privilege and honor to hear from you. You did actually address my question, and I was trying to ask you about the current crisis of higher education happening in the US, but you did mention that it might be more of a hyperbole. So let me pivot my question more towards the measurement of learning in higher education. Traditionally, we use the Carnegie unit of seat time. And there's been a lot of conversations around rethinking that model of measurement of learning. And especially as we move towards more of measuring skills and competencies, a lot of edtech companies are focusing on that. And I read about articles seeing the need of, or calling out the higher education institutes to try and change and adapt. And I think last week at the ASU GSV summit, I believe ETS made an announcement partnering with the Carnegie institution around really rethinking the credit hour and figuring out how to better measure the various skill levels to showcase, so that candidates can showcase their skills to potential employers. Your thoughts on about this how higher education can evolve and adapt to this trend around measurement of learning?
Yeah, it's interesting actually. I met, weirdly, I was in Delhi at the GSV event in Delhi a couple of months ago, and I met Amit, the CEO of ETS, and we had this very conversation that this idea of seat time is just no longer appropriate. We need to really rethink this area. And I think you're right. I mean, in higher education, it's really, really challenging, isn't it? And we've had these conversations for years, and I know the OECD was very keen on these conversations, that we haven't really got any clear measure of learning gain, of consistent outcomes, because you have a real problem that, because universities tend to often ride on their reputations. You'll have stories where a student might go to a prestige institution, get a terrible experience, not really like the experience, but actually they're quite happy with the name on the certificate because that's the currency. And then you have stories like, I always remember a former president of Tokyo University saying that Tokyo University in Japan has the most lazy students in the world because it's so hard to get in. Once they're in, they've made it. Their careers, their lives are sorted. They are a Tokyo student, a Tokyo graduate. Who cares what they learn? They've already made it. They've already been filtered. And I think maybe the IITs may have an issue there, that it's so hard to get in that just being there is all you need now. You're an IIT graduate. So there is an issue around how much of it is a social sorting hat, that you made it in, you're with a peer group that will be inherently successful. They're the top of their high school classes. So the challenge of learning gain in higher ed is a huge issue. And the OECD tried a project called the HELLO project, I think, Assessment of Higher Education Learning Outcomes. And it was really exciting because they were saying they'll completely disrupt the sector. You know, if you go into Harvard as an elite student and you just sort of stay awake for 3 years, 4 years and come out the other end, you're fine. But if you've gone to a more challenging community college or a less prestigious institution with a lot of challenge in your life and with a lower start, but they give you that much more of a journey. They advance you much more through their education. That's something we need to cherish and recognize, and it's important for social mobility. So funnily enough, actually, one of the vague conversations I had with Amit at ETS is could we look to reinvent that? Because the OECD, it didn't get off the ground. They couldn't get enough buy-in from member nations, possibly because you may discover, who knows, that the elite prestigious universities of the global north may not necessarily deliver on these measures compared to dynamic, young, less well-known institutions in India or elsewhere. So the status quo was something that a lot of universities had a self-interest in protecting. So from Times Higher's perspective, it's a challenge, but we're looking at the challenge. One of the things we did the Wall Street Journal rankings for the in the US. We did their college rankings. We were the data source and the methodology source for several years. We introduced things like value add, so looking at algorithmically entry points and exit points and distance traveled. But that's quite it's maths rather than actual assessment. So I do really admire these initiatives to rethink actual assessments themselves and sort of verify across different institutions, different countries, what are the sort of basic skills that are required and how do we make them consistent? And of course, give employers a really clear vision of what actual skills students have. So yeah, sorry, it's that, again, a long, slightly rambling answer, but there's a lot happening in the field of assessment, even basics like what should be assessed, how should we assess it? The pandemic, I think, highlighted that a traditional 3-hour timed seated exam is probably not necessarily reflective of reality, hard to proctor remotely. But more importantly, is that how you get challenged and tested in real life? Problem-based, group-based. The types of assessment themselves, I think, need a rethink as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Harish. May I now invite Prashant for his question?
Thanks, Ankur. Hi, Phil. Thanks for all the insights. And I'd like to touch upon the ports and quants acquisition of THE. It was big news. And you talked about rankings, you talked about news about education, and both the organizations are doing so well. So what are the kind of synergies we anticipate now? What is going to change? What is going to come in form of innovation? If you could throw some more light on that, please.
Well, thank you very much, Prasant. Yeah, we were very excited to announce that we've acquired Poets and Quants. I think from Times Higher's perspective, we have a world audience. We have incredibly rich penetration of higher education globally across the world. But I think the one area where we didn't have such great expertise and penetration was in the business school space. Times Higher's core audience and our colleagues at Inside Higher Ed, our core audience is academic faculty themselves, and it's people who work in higher education as professionals. But of course, with the world rankings, we've seen more and more students and prospective students coming to our website looking at rankings. So a few years ago, we launched THE Student, which was part of our website that's entirely for the young people themselves, the would-be prospective students seeking education. So it's advisory services, it's information for students. Because what used to happen, you'd come to THE and look at rankings. If you're a 15, 16-year-old Indian student thinking, I want to study abroad, you come into our rankings and you can see the table, but all of the content would be about how to manage a university, how to run a lecture, how to control your finances, how to develop a multi-billion-pound research strategy. So we've started giving content to students. So we've got a growing platform of students consuming our content, looking at rankings. We also acquired a business called BMI, which is the largest, most successful leading student recruitment events business in the world. And we just felt P&Q filled a really, really good, important hole there, that they have obviously a very large, incredibly powerful audience of prospective business school students. So for us, it was about filling a gap in our activity. It was about joining forces to have this amazing audience of prospective business students with the BMI student audience and our THE student audience. And we can do a lot more with those in terms of supporting decision making, whether that might be eventually lead generation, but whether it might be just providing information and support for those student journeys. So we've got access to millions and millions of students who are looking and hungry for information, looking and hungry for their educational opportunities. So our ability to support those students and support the universities who want those students is really, really powerful. And finally, I think with Poets and Quants, they do some rankings, but not many. And we, of course, have 20 years and 25, 30 people specializing in data and rankings. So I wouldn't be surprised if maybe we join forces and develop some more specific rankings outcomes for business schools, whether that might be around specific growth degrees, masters in business administration and analytics, masters in management, maybe some specific consumer type rankings in the business area. But it's very young. We've only really been officially together for a few weeks. Of course, we've been doing a lot more behind the scenes, but yeah, huge potential to collaborate. And finally, just to say, globalizing it, Poets and Quants obviously is primarily US based, US focused, but we can make sure there's a proper global understanding of the business school environment. And of course, Indian business education is also a thriving area, and we'd love to do more to cover that and make that more visible to prospective students as well.
Thanks, Phil. That's insightful.
Thank you.
Thanks, Prashant. Neeraj, you can go ahead. You can ask your question.
Yeah, thanks, Ankur. Hi, Phil. Thanks for the insights. Phil, I just wanted to understand the perspective of media and education. I think ranking plays a huge role. So how can the smaller tech companies leverage, is there some APIs available where we can kind of look at what kind of rankings are available for college so that we can also give the accessibility to our students?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we want our data to be used for insights and to inform people. So I think we're very open to the idea of collaborating to empower that sort of student decision making, student choice. So yeah, we're always open to discussing how do we ensure the rich data we have is deployed as powerfully and as effectively as possible. Because obviously we have the rankings on our website, but of course the data beneath those rankings is extraordinarily rich and deep, and they can give very, very detailed insight. So yeah, we're open to collaborating with other corporates to say, look, can we combine data to provide entirely unprecedented new insights for consumers or for universities? Or can we share data in a way that really empowers decision making? So yeah, we're open to that. It's obviously a case by case basis, but yeah, we have a wonderful resource, and we're keen to ensure it's deployed as powerfully as possible to help decision making.
Thanks, Neeraj. Do you have a follow-up question, or can I proceed?
No, I just wanted to, I'll check out the site and probably reach out to Phil on LinkedIn for that. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Neeraj. I mean, there is one more question that has been sent in by Soma Dam, who is the Dean of Academics and Innovation at Sun City School in Gurugram. Unfortunately, she's not able to make it, but I'll ask her question for Phil. I mean, she has asked, and she works in a school, and she's one of the well-known career counselors in the country. She has asked, what do rankings also effectively hide or camouflage? Can the more broad objective of education be truly captured quantitatively? I think Phil, over to you.
It's very important, I think, for rankers to acknowledge that, rankings can only really use data that's available and comparable, right? So when you look at the world rankings, for example, we're looking at, there's about 3,000 universities submit data, and they're from about 115 plus countries. So rich, deep data that might be available at a national level is very rarely available on an international level across the entire world. So there will always be things that rankers would love to get their hands on that just isn't available globally. And that's why sometimes national rankings can be a bit more rich and a bit more consumer driven than global rankings. Global rankings are restricted to those big global metrics like research publications, research citations, reputation, and then proxies for teaching like faculty student ratios or resources. So we should always be aware from the teaching side, the rich side of education, that rankings at the global level are relatively simplistic. You know, I think the QS ranking has one single metric of teaching, which is faculty student ratio. That seems entirely inadequate today when you have blended learning environments, you have MOOCs, and you have different ways of delivering. I think the Shanghai ranking almost it rewards the Nobel Prize back to the undergraduate university as if that's a reflection of great teaching, even though there may be several decades of research after that. So yes, you're right, rankings can miss important aspects of data, but even more importantly, there are areas of higher education that data will never capture. You know, the human side of an individual's lives transformed. We have a big debate in the UK about graduate outcomes, saying, well, if it's an investment, we want graduate outcomes based on salary. And of course, if you're making an investment, your return on investment could be judged by a future salary. That's a legitimate data point. But there are jobs that are low paid that are incredibly valuable to society. You know, not least teachers and nurses, and certainly in the UK, that are massively undervalued. And of course, there are jobs that are hugely enriching, that may not provide a regular income, you know, in the arts and in culture, music. So there are so many intangibles of education that are wonderful and can't be measured. And then, of course, there are all these other things like citizenship, engagement with democracy, democratic engagement, the word I was looking for, improved health, personal health, all these extraordinary things that do tend to come from a higher education that are almost intangible benefits that we can never measure. So rankings are inherently crude. They reduce the wonderful complexity of a university to simple numbers. Those numbers can be very powerful, very important, but they can also mask outstandingly beautiful, wonderful things that universities do, and we just have to acknowledge that they'll never capture everything. But we should use them with that level of awareness and care.
Absolutely. And see, Phil, I have a lot of questions in my diary, but I like to ask something which is, very close to my heart. I mean, as somebody who is, very passionate about Indian higher education and the impact that it's having on the lives ever since our independence. And so as someone who, Times Higher Education is actually the buzzword for higher education in India right now, and the couple of other rankings. I mean, and you are working with governments a lot. You're working with, I'm sure, with the Indian government also in some capacity or some policy making with our leaders. How do you see the evolution of our higher education sector? I mean, broadly speaking, I mean, what are our strengths? And, what will be, if you were to give us some advice on, how we can actually work towards making a higher education sector which is vibrant and not repeat the mistakes that probably universities in the West have made or other developed countries have made. I mean, how do you see India? Because now with the growing economy, and you talked about it in your initial remark, that it's higher education is actually a force for good. It actually has the capacity to transform lives. And now that we are growing at a very fast rate, and if we see globally, India is one of the fastest growing economies, and it is projected to be such for next many years. How do you see India, taking a stride in higher education? What are those steps that you would probably 2-3 steps that you would advise us?
Well, I think the most important thing I would say is that actually I believe that the NEP is in a really good place. It's obviously been thoroughly researched and actually is more pioneering than many countries. So I think one of the wonderful things I find whenever I visit India is the dynamism. You know, I think there are frustrations that There's a lot of bureaucracy in the public sector. There's frustration in terms of process, bureaucracy, slow movement, slow decision making in the public sector. There's, of course, I think, problems with relatively underfunding. Funding is scarce, and the public universities aren't necessarily funded in the same way that they are in other rapidly developing countries, China always being a good example. But within those constraints and those challenges, the scale of the challenge, the size of the task, but the size of the opportunity, I think, has injected lots of dynamism into India, loads of innovation. So I look at the private universities in India. There are some really exciting, dynamic private universities who are moving more agile. They're able to innovate. They can move more quickly. So I think that's amazing. Their mixed economy, the injection of competition and different types and sizes and shapes of universities is amazing. I think the scale of the challenge around the sheer size of your youth population and the importance of educating that youth population, because if you don't, there's a massive social problem coming. But that scale of the problem has meant there's so much ed tech innovation in India. I mentioned earlier I was in Delhi just a few months ago for a GSV event. And the ed tech sector in India is absolutely thriving. It's so exciting. I think I can't remember the figure, but a huge proportion of the world's investment in Indian a huge proportion of the world's investment in ed tech is in Indian ed tech. I don't want to get the figure wrong, but I think it might be something huge, like 25% or something. But don't quote me on that. So that's amazing. There's so much really great stuff happening. I think the remaining issue for me is, can we truly open up India to global competition and global learning? I don't think any education now, of course, you've got education for local skills, you've got, upskilling for local economic needs that can be done at a national level. But for me, truly world-class education, truly transformative education tends to happen in a global context with global citizens, with intercultural understanding and learning from one another globally. So for me, the last hurdle, it is in the NEP, but can we genuinely open up India to branch campuses from abroad? Can we power up the two-way streams of talent? So it's not just a question of Indian students feeling they have to go to abroad to America or Europe to get their education. So the test for me is, can we more fully internationalize Indian education? The lovely thing I've seen actually is with rankings, the Indian participation in rankings has more than doubled in recent years. So I remember going 10 years ago, I met the ministers at the time. There was an argument saying India doesn't need global rankings. It's not relevant. We have our own issues. Who cares about global? We're not attracting international students. But I was arguing that actually international rankings are not just about attracting talent. They're about benchmarking. They're about understanding yourself. They're about using data to get a clearer vision of where your challenges and opportunities and weaknesses are, and to provide strategic direction. And since then, I think, we've seen, I think we now have 75 Indian universities. It's the fourth best represented nation on the planet in the world rankings, and it will grow more. We're just closing data for the next cycle. We'll see more Indian universities than ever before, but they're all now on the world stage. They're benchmarking themselves. They're holding themselves to account. They're opening themselves up to scrutiny. They're standing shoulder to shoulder with other universities worldwide. They're being available for collaboration. So very, very long answer, but my take is India is absolutely going in the right direction in terms of innovation, in terms of internationalization, and in terms of ambition. So I don't know, that doesn't quite answer your question, does it? But it gives you my flavor of my own perceptions of India.
No, absolutely, Phil. That really helps. And I think you made complete sense when you talked about the various aspects that we should be looking at as we develop our higher education sector here. But yeah, I have Bhakti with me. I mean, she was not able to make it in the initial remarks because of a medical emergency. I don't want to talk about in detail for that, but Bhakti, over to you.
Thank you, Ankur, and so lovely to be here. Phil, you have no idea how gutted I was to miss most of your session. I was looking forward to this so much, and I'm going to watch the entire recording. So be rest assured you will get at least one view from this entire session. But that apart, Phil, you mentioned about the new age universities and private universities mushroom in India, and then that they're ready for internationalization. But yet, we do not have international students looking at India as a destination. And there is something that is sincerely stopping us from seeking out. And it's not just about the private universities, it's also about the public universities, some of the finest in the world. We do not see India making significant progress when it comes to admitting or reaching out to international students. Why is that? What do you think is stopping us as a country? What do you think we can do differently? Because we have what it takes, we have the ingredients. We're not the most unsafe country in the world. What do you think we can do to fix this?
Do you know what? I think it's actually about, well, there's probably two things. One is I think the bureaucracy was preventing it being a priority. So no one was incentivized to do it. There was too many bureaucratic hurdles to welcome international students in partnerships. Obviously, that's being addressed, and I think there's some really positive progress on that. So if you can get the bureaucracy sorted and make sure that the actual process itself is straightforward, I think it actually comes down to something really simple, which is storytelling. There is a sense that India is one of the, or is perhaps the most exciting country in the world, right? It's the world's largest democracy. It has the most extraordinary rich culture. It has a history of the first emerging universities in the history of humanity. It has perhaps some of the most exciting technological innovation in the world. Driven by many of its challenges. Of course, it has huge challenges. It has huge challenges of inequality. It has huge challenges of poverty and, challenges. But those challenges make it an extraordinarily exciting place to be a young person developing a career, developing skills. So I almost feel that we all know India is an incredibly popular tourist destination because of the beautiful multicultural scenery, but actually, could we sell India, brand India as a student destination? What would make it, if you're a young, ambitious person who wants to make a difference in the world, what better place to do that than India? So, you look at the rest of the world, most of the world who are recruiting markets, so Australia, Great Britain, United States of America, probably the three biggest they are the three biggest markets for international students. With the exception of America, that's obviously proportionally it's not so high. Britain and Australia have got massive national marketing campaigns. They've got, Austrade and entire major campaigns dedicated to selling the virtues and advertising the virtues of studying in Australia. It might be about, wine and sunshine and relative cost of living and quality of life, but also great universities. The United Kingdom, of course, has a massive campaign dedicated to it. So telling the story, getting the message out there that actually India is, for me, one of the most dynamic and exciting countries in the world. And why wouldn't you, as an ambitious person who wants to make a difference to the world in your own personal development, why wouldn't you want a piece of that? But of course, that's just storytelling and national branding. And of course, within that national branding, you've got the phenomenal diversity of India as well, which of course is another set of conversation.
I think Indian universities just wanting to get a ranking in THE is the first step, or QS is the first step. And I really hope that we see a change in this. This was incredibly insightful and gives us a lot at TOC to think about from a collaboration and a consortium approach perspective for Indian universities to put themselves out there in the global education destination map.
And
Thank you,
certainly
Ankur, for letting me ask. Yeah, go ahead.
And I'd say, the Indian universities' participation in rankings is exploding. It's huge. 75 Indian universities in the world rankings. I think it's 60 odd in our impact ranking. So if Times Higher Education can help put them on the map, help them showcase their strengths, you know, the impact rankings for me are amazing. You could say, like, did you know that Ashoka University is one of the best in the world for delivering on the SDGs? So if you're a sustainably minded student, suddenly you've got that spotlight, that global platform to say, you know, University X is making a difference. We're changing the world. We're at the forefront of climate action, or at the forefront of the sustainable development agenda. That you can tell your stories through that data, through the case studies of excellence that come through the global rankings platform. So yeah, rankers should do their job.
I think it would be incredibly helpful, Phil, if we were to get some guidance from THE on global case studies and what countries have done to position themselves, because this is going to really help India. Because I know for a fact at this point that there are very siloed efforts to put us on the map, and siloed efforts never get you global domination. And I think that collaboration is the only way. So if THE were to guide TOC and figure out a way to give best practices out to our university members in a way that we can come together and put ourselves out there, including rankings, because rankings is a real thing, I think that would be incredibly helpful. But that's my time. And Ankur, thank you so much for letting me ask this question.
Most welcome, Bhakti. Thank you for being here. In spite of all the health issues, but I'm happy that you are making it and smiling for all of us. Thank you. So I have a comment by Zafina in the chat. She says the national branding is so important. Developing a campaign akin to education is created by the UK government is a very important step. The investment is high, and this might be a huge deterrent. Actually, Zafina, I mean, as somebody who has worked in international education and promoting Indian universities abroad, both Ashoka and Jindal, I mean, I've done a lot of work in this space. The government of India actually has a budget of about 10 crore rupees. I don't know how much it will be in US dollars or pounds, but 10 crores, that's a substantial sum of money. They run a campaign called Study in India, and it is run by EdSil, wherein they go in and promote our education, higher education, especially mostly in developing countries. I mean, Africa, they have regularly visited Africa. They have been visiting South Asia. And if you see our international student numbers, most of our students, there are about 48,000 students that come into India every year for higher education. Almost 50% of them, or 50 to 60% of them, come from our neighboring countries, which is Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. I mean, the neighbor, the South Asian community. And then we have the other big set of students coming in from Africa. One of the challenges that just quickly, and I want to add to Bhakti's point and Phil's point, absolutely, we need to have a story to be told. I mean, we need to do better at selling brand India. And there are some technical issues, because I'm sitting in Kenya and I brought in a couple of, I mean, there are 4 Indian universities that I'm helping to recruit from Africa right now. And they are all of them are top institutions. I don't want to name them, but one of the best institutions for attracting international students. And when I talk to their director for international student recruitment, one of the challenges that comes across very easily, and any student will ask that, is what is the post-study work option? And in India, you don't get a visa to stay back. So the moment a student finishes his higher education, he has to go back. And that is a big problem for many international students, even from Africa. I mean, I talk to them on a daily basis right here in my work, and I try to tell them about the India story. It's just that it doesn't work. And I think the policy has to be looked into. But thank you so much, Phil, for enlightening us. And anybody wants to have a go at a question, or I can go ahead and ask my questions that I have. I have many of them. Is there send something in the chat? Yeah, Johnson has said in the last input by Phil on narrative of Indian higher education is a great critical area of focus. TOC can easily harness its collective DNA to make this possible. Great motivator indeed. Thank you, Johnson. I totally agree with you. So Phil, moving on to apart from India, I want to move on to global higher education space. And I knew we talked about it and touched upon it briefly. But I mean, another question post-pandemic has been Can digital replace physical? Future of hybrid learning? Overcoming the digital disparity. We all know, the disparities that exist. I mean, digital is not also that accessible. Not everybody, especially in global south, has access to internet or a mobile phone or a laptop. How accessible can we make digital education? So your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, it's not going to be a sort of magic wand that solves all the problems, but I think it does certainly make a phenomenally important contribution. On two levels. One is on reducing cost, so that we don't make sure there's not this subprime debt that Indian students or international students get into, where they've invested hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they're not able to repay that debt because they're not getting the careers and the jobs at the end. So we have to be really mindful of more exploitative educational models, and offer real value for money. Otherwise, we'll have huge problems there. And digital, I think, can at least help reduce costs and provide better value for money if there's a blended approach. But digital, of course, does provide this opportunity to massively expand access. And the really interesting challenge for me is, the emergence of MOOCs, the mass open access courses. That obviously years ago there was a sense that would they revolutionize higher education completely by destroying the model, because anyone could sit down in their bedroom, or anyone with a Wi-Fi connection could sit in their bedroom and do a course at Harvard, a course at Stanford. And if they could work out a way of accrediting those, you're getting extremely high quality education at a fraction of the price. And why wouldn't Harvard export its education to a mass market? And then you've got that awful challenge around the rarity and preserving rarity and reducing access to preserve the market value. So there's some really thorny challenges there, but ultimately, I think we have to make quality education available to as many people as we possibly can, and we have to find models to do that. And we have to find cost-effective models to do that. And I'm absolutely convinced that the flipped classroom version, where you can piece together outstanding content from MOOCs from Stanford or Harvard or Tsinghua or Tokyo, and bring those into a classroom on the ground in a village in India, and there's on in-person aspects, and there's tuition support and pastoral care and communities where it can all be debated and thrashed out. I think that has to be a really important way forward. Particularly somewhere like India, where the volume of people who need an education is absolutely huge, and we have to find mechanisms to get them that education. Otherwise, you're going to have a disenfranchised youth population, which could cause huge problems. So digital has a vital role in the future. Exactly how we manage it, and exactly how the mix of in-person and digital works, and exactly how we make sure that in-person doesn't become just a privilege of an elite few, lounging on a well-manicured lawn with ivy climbing up the walls in the West, in the global North. We need to make sure that in-person isn't for a privileged few and digital is for the rest. But digital is going to be massive in opening access and finding cost-effective ways to do it at scale.
I agree with you personally. I think that's the way forward. We also have a question in the chat from Puneet Chaudhary. And I think this is another interesting aspect of higher education as we develop here in India, is the industry exposure that we give to our students. I mean, there's a lot of talk. I'm sure, Phil, you have read about it. A lot of our graduates are unemployable. They have gone through higher education, but their industry experience is not adequate. And there is a deep debate around the disconnect between what academia is serving and what industry wants. I mean, and he has asked you a question focused on UK. He has asked, how is the industry exposure taken care of by higher education institutions in UK? I mean, what are the policies or processes in place? If you can talk about that.
I think, there's there's specific structural elements to make sure that universities are thinking of their third mission, so that they're very engaged in their local businesses and communities. So there's lots of specific funding streams to help universities access small, medium-sized enterprises in their neighborhoods, to build innovation hubs, to provide a regulatory framework to have knowledge parks and science parks, in and around campuses. So there's lots of infrastructural support there. But ultimately, I think it comes down to consumer demand that, British universities are held to account for graduate outcomes. There is a national annual process where universities who aren't, and to be frank, graduate outcomes are very strong in the UK, but, universities are ranked on this. You can see how many of their graduates go on to further study or to what they call graduate level jobs. There is talk in the United Kingdom of actually very strictly linking graduate outcomes to funding, in terms of even the ability to charge fees or to charge fees at a higher rate. So it's not quite there yet, but the government is really keen to make sure that actually the consumer drives this, that if a consumer says, well, that university doesn't have a track record in getting students into jobs, then students will have access to that data and will vote with their feet and not go there. So the government's really sort of trying to make it consumer-led and empowering the consumer to make an informed choice by seeing those universities that aren't producing employable graduates. So data, again, plays a big role in providing that consumer information framework. But yeah, there is talk about, I think in the UK it's very specific, because I think we have a problem now that the sort of government can't really afford the system anymore, because we've had significant expansion. We have 50% participation. The public debt there, because the government pays tuition fees up front, students pay them back when they graduate, and only when they hit a certain earning threshold. The government is effectively, I think, struggling with the sheer cost and the size of the student debt burden on the state. So the government's having lots of challenging conversations about how do we actually cap student numbers? How do we make sure that courses that aren't delivering student outcomes would be suffer market failure, basically. So some of it's market information, some of it's maybe some stronger mechanisms down the line. Sorry, I'm coughing. So
No
for me, it's empowering the consumer, using data and using sticks and carrots to support that. But also, universities want to stay relevant, so they're constantly engaging with employers and making sure there's placements and making sure they have a very clear dialogue with employers. And the idea is universities that aren't delivering outcomes for their graduates get exposed through data, through national data, and students choose not to take those options.
Absolutely. Phil, I'm looking at the clock. We have under 5 minutes left. I mean, I'm sitting in Kenya. I mean, it will not be right if I don't ask you a question on Africa. I mean, I saw that you came out with Africa rankings, and there was some focus work that Times is doing on Africa as a continent. How do you see, I mean, Africa coming up globally as a higher education destination? I mean, there are a few very good institutions from Africa who are in the global rankings, and I think you are now having Africa university rankings as well. So if you can just share your thoughts on Africa as a destination for higher education.
Well, I think it's very, very patchy. There's no question that many African nations are suffering from, very, very challenging conditions. Some of the African universities are, struggle with basic infrastructure, struggle with underfunding. But within that, there are clearly some booming African economies. There are clearly some thriving African universities. I've actually just written a blog for the World Economic Forum specifically about Africa rising in ranking. So they're not necessarily rising as in shooting up the league tables, but they're one of the fastest improving nations, as a group of nations. And their participation in rankings is growing. So we went from 4 African universities in the rankings a decade ago to, I think, about I've forgotten the number now. It's about 70, 80, actually 97, I think it is. But that's still a tiny proportion of the continent's universities. But what we're seeing is more of them on the world stage, more of them in the world rankings, more of them making progress in the world rankings, getting that visibility in the world rankings, engaging in that global dialogue on the world stage, and then opening themselves up to collaboration, to international opportunities, international students. But obviously, at the moment, Africa is still very much a sending nation. Their students are leaving Africa to get the best education. The idea of the sub-Saharan African ranking is, we know that world rankings are, they still, as we've talked about, they still do privilege a Western version of excellence, a global North version of excellence. They still privilege the prestigious, wealthy universities who pull all the talent in and pay the high salaries and have the big endowments. We wanted to produce a ranking that recognizes local context. So what are the things that matter most on the ground in Africa, or certainly Africa south of the Sahara? Social and economic impact, graduate outcomes, delivering for students. So that's where we want to produce a bespoke ranking for that region, to allow the universities to benchmark themselves, to develop a habit of collecting data and using that data for strategic reasons, and then allowing that potential progression up into the world rankings if that's the choice of the institution. So harmonizing with world rankings, but with more bespoke data elements that are relevant to the immediate needs of those groups of countries south of the Sahara.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Bhakti, you want to chip in?
Yeah, I just want to say that I think, Phil, THE has phenomenal power to pivot where we are at in international education outreach and positioning countries as desired destinations. And I think that you guys have done a phenomenal job so far. And I think it's time for Africa, literally. It's time for Africa. It's also time for Asia. It's also time for India. And I think that THE can play a huge role in positioning us as not just the pool from which the feeder pools, but also the pools from which we are fed in. And I think we are great destinations for inviting and accepting students from the rest of the world. So there's a lot of work for us to be done in the next few decades. And I really hope that TOC can make some difference to this. And we really look forward to seeing the work that THE does in positioning this part of the world as desired destinations as well, and potential study destinations. So that's all. And thank you, Phil. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much.
We take that role very seriously, and I think we will absolutely use our platform. Our biggest power is convening power, bringing communities together in very large numbers globally. So we don't take that responsibility lightly. We absolutely will be continuing to endeavor to do that.
Thank you so much, Phil. I mean, we have come to the end of our session. I mean, 90 minutes have gone by in a jiffy, and we had such a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for being patient with us and answering all our questions. I think we covered a lot of other questions that we shared with you before, but thank you so much for being generous with your time, being generous with your experience, being generous with your knowledge. I mean, this is what TOC is all about, people learning from each other, people learning from stalwarts like you, and driving the conversation of higher education, admissions, outreach, career counseling here in not only in India, but globally. So thank you so much, Phil. And we'll hope that TOC and Times and you personally, we can stay connected and we can probably work together in some other areas as well in coming near future. So thank you, Phil. Thank you so much, all the TOCians that have been here for the last 90 minutes. Much appreciated. Your questions, your engagement with the community is much appreciated. And we do hope that you continue enjoying these sessions and continue learning for yourself, and then creating a positive impact for your students who you serve. Thank you, and good night to everyone. Good day, everyone, wherever you may be. Thank you, Phil. Bye-bye.
Thank you.